Welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. Today, we're joined by NYG&B President D. Joshua Taylor and State Archivist Tom Ruller for a discussion of best practices for maintaining your home archives, including identifying materials to preserve, organizing objects and papers, and steps to ensure your collections remain an integral part of your family's story. Josh Taylor, president of the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, is a nationally known and recognized genealogical author, lecturer, and researcher. Josh is deeply passionate about family history, is a frequent speaker at family history events across the globe, and hosts the popular PBS series Genealogy Roadshow. He's also a past contributor to New York Archives Magazine, which I'm proud to say. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom has been an active professional and is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. He's been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. Just a little housekeeping. After the talk, we'll have a question and answer period. So please feel free, to those of you in the audience, to submit questions using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit those throughout the talk, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. So now I am pleased to introduce Josh Taylor and Tom Ruller.
Thank you, Josie, and welcome to everyone. I think this is going to be a really exciting and I think personally gratifying conversation today. And poor Josh is on the hot seat. I've got 2 pages of questions I'd like to go through with you, if you don't mind.
Not a problem. Happy to be here.
Well, good. Well, maybe we can just start off with this big question. We all have a lot of material that we inherit from our parents and our grandparents and our aunts and our uncles. My house is full of stuff. I call it my daughter's memorial archive. But I think one of the first questions we all have to deal with is, what documents, photos, etc. should we keep? What's archival? What should we be focusing on?
It's a really good question. And actually, I think one of the things that stops a lot of people in starting, I know even in my own family, there is just so much stuff. And, the first thing I learned my first day of library school was an archivist's job is to determine what not to keep. And that's a really, really interesting question, because we by default want to keep everything. So what is archival? Well, specifically, I look for original materials. We might have 10 copies of a photograph, but I might keep those 10 copies. But if I have an original copy, I might only keep the original and then a couple of preservation copies. So really looking for original materials as much as possible in their original format. And when you look specifically at what is archival for a specific family, you're looking for photographs, you're looking for documents, you're looking for things that show genealogical and biographical information. Now, I oftentimes think that what's archival to one family might not necessarily be archival to another. So just for example, my grandmother was a great cook, and her recipes are family recipes. And to our family, that is an important part of the family archive. And so whenever I come across a family recipe from her and the recipe card, we preserve that. That's part of our family's archive. My father was a musician, so music and objects that have to do with his life are archival within my family. But it really, it's a good consideration to take a moment and look at, what do we want to make sure is around in 100 years versus what is the other stuff. But also, I really have a hard time and going through and saying, well, yes or no, in developing a checklist, because, for example, things like checkbooks, duplicate checkbooks, those might seem mundane records, but in reality, that's a record of someone's life. And so it really depends family by family when you're trying to answer that question. But again, pull back original documents, original records, versus copies after copy of something, but also documents that help to put together someone's life or a family story, rather than just trying to take on all the paper at once.
Excellent. I liked your point about what's archival to one family may be archival to a different family. And if you were to come up with sort of I'll say the top 10, but you don't start with 10, the top 10 list of the most essential family records that everyone should make sure they have, what would be on that list?
So vital records, certainly birth, marriage, and death certificates and associated documents, number one. I would put photographs at number 2, photographs of relatives and of family members. Certainly number 3 would be letters and diaries that someone has gathered. And the fourth item would be what I would sort of sanction as certificates, military discharge certificates, employment certificates, things that sort of show that biographical story. I would absolutely make sure that you keep. So sort of a top couple, I guess, there for things to look at.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of methods for preserving some of the things that you just listed. And you mentioned diaries. We watched last week the newly elected president take the oath of office on a great big old family Bible. And if you read about what's in there, it's the story of the family and his life and others before him. What are some good ways to preserve those books that we have, that family Bible or that diary or the ledger book or whatever it might be? What are some good approaches to preserving books?
So preserving books, the first thing that I do from a genealogical standpoint is actually to create some sort of a preservation copy of the material itself. I want to preserve that Bible for as long as possible, but I also want to make sure that I'm preserving the information on it. And so I will take a safe preservation copy of the material. It could be a photograph with my phone. It used to be an in-depth scan, but I will first, before I start, I'll document it in some way so that I have a copy of it if something were to go wrong. Then there are archival boxes and tissue paper that you can use to sort of preserve some books, but don't just stick the book in a box and put it on the shelf. You should be leafing through its pages for anything that might be leafed in or sort of imprints, flowers, those types of things that over time will actually degrade the quality of the paper and can destroy the material. So you want to try and remove those materials safely so that you don't damage that. And then also the other thing that I look for is pages that might have handwriting on them. And I layer basically a archival safe tissue in between those pages so that it doesn't fade or rub off over time. One of my family Bibles, I had an ancestor who was extremely, extremely devout, and she wrote, after she finished every single chapter in the Bible, notes about that. And so I literally started to interleave paper in between, because over time that will gradually erode and can destroy the material. But this, particularly for family record pages that might be in the middle of the Bible, you want to sort of put some tissue paper around that and then safely keep it within that archival safe box and lay it flat, never up on its side or sort of on end. You don't want to break the binding.
Okay, great. Well, okay, we got lots of books. Now I have in my house a couple of boxes of letters from World War II era, back and forth from overseas back here to the States. So I have boxes and boxes of paper documents. What are some strategies and approaches I can use to deal with those loose pieces of paper?
So loose pieces of paper, what at least I've done with some of my family archives and seen others do is, again, with an archival safe box and also the sort of acid-free archival folders, and begin storing those papers in folders. You never want to overfill a folder, but you also don't necessarily have to put one page per folder depending upon the item type. So I might take a letter that's 10 pages long and put that in a folder versus a handful of letters that are all about the same subject and put that together in a folder. The other key part of that is to separate the actual material type. right? I never would interleave newspaper in with regular paper, and newspaper being highly acidic would degrade over time. So you want to try and separate out that material type. So it's a process of putting them in folders by material type, but then also, not trying to put everything in one folder, but also it's not about one paper per folder. Otherwise, you would spend the rest of your life just putting the papers sort of, folder by folder by folder.
Okay. Well, you mentioned newspapers. They're a special breed of animal, I think. What are some strategies to deal with those newspapers? Some of the ones that I have are just falling apart and they're 30 years old. Right.
And, I have everything from newspaper clippings to actual full newspapers. And one of the key things is, keep them flat. You don't want to leave them folded or crumpled. You want to keep them flat. You want to put them in sort of the buffered file folders to protect them and keep them really on their own. The key with newspapers, flat and separate from other materials. So I have a giant flat archival box that is newspapers and then clipped obituaries and clipped marriage announcements. I lay them out so they don't touch each other and try and leave them as flat and sort of as isolated as possible in that file.
Okay. And then we've talked about photographs. We all have those boxes and boxes and boxes of photographs. And I often pull out a photograph. I sort of kind of know who that photograph is. Oh, I remember that was so-and-so. What are some approaches we can take just to preserve those photographs and ensure that they continue to be not degrade?
So one thing that you can do is you can buy sort of photo sleeves for even, you can buy negative sleeves, you can buy sleeves, certain type of photographs. And you want to keep them in a box again, but you want to keep them in a sleeve, particularly the older photographs. And you want to keep those separated. You want to keep them bunched up together. That's a one photograph per sleeve. Usually when they're older photographs, you want to put a whole bunch in there. And one thing that I will usually do with a photograph is, just like with the family Bible, I'll take a picture of it first, and then I always turn it over and I take a picture of the back. And whether or not the back has writing on it, I will always take a picture of it so that I know that when I put that in that sleeve, there was or was not anything on the back as I sort of work to preserve that. But with photos, I'm very, I wouldn't say I'm nervous to touch photos, but I will do a digital version of that photograph, and then I will carefully sleeve the original away, and I will not touch it unless I absolutely have to.
Right. Well, and with photographs, and I alluded to this when I was asking my question, I've got lots of photographs, and you talked about writing on the back. Some of my photographs have some writing, some don't. Are there things that we should do to photographs in particular, but anything that we have, to make sure that it continues to be useful to those who are going to see and interact with this document or photo or whatever long after we're gone and we pass it along to the next generation?
Right. It's such an important question, because I have photographs that were passed along to me, and I remember hearing the story about the photograph, and now I look at it and I can't remember the details of the story. So I think one thing is to leave a written record, or if you want to leave a voice record through your phone or your tablet or a video, but leave a record somewhere of the importance of the photograph. I sort of have the mentality I have is, if I were to only be able to grab one or two boxes, and I sort of make sure I put the photographs that are most important to me and my family and their research in those boxes. But I also make sure that I share listings of what's in those boxes with a wide number of relatives, because knowing the value of something is oftentimes achieved by at least knowing what's inside it and how it's been described. And so while the original of the photograph might not be in their possession, family members might already have a digital copy of it, but also that listing that you keep with it and circulate, so that people know exactly what's in the boxes and what photographs are there, how they're preserved, so they don't have to go digging into the box all the time. But also I think someone is more likely to hold on to something and pass it along if they know what it is and they know the value. And that's beyond just box of photographs from grandma.
Got it. Is that what they call metadata?
That's metadata. Absolutely. Data about data. You want to give your relatives the key pieces of information they need about the photograph, the people, the places, and sort of why it's important in that sense.
Josh, you talked about the tissue, the archival tissue paper. You talked about the photographic sleeves and all of that. Where can we get that? Can you go to the Rite Aid?
Well, there are a couple of what I would call sort of, there are a couple of brands that sort of in the mass market sell acid-free products. I usually would look to a company like Gaylord Archival Products. Hollinger is another company. And one thing that I particularly like about Gaylord, and full disclosure, I don't work for Gaylord. I just use their stuff. It's great. And they've actually put together preservation kits for certain types of materials. So when I was archiving and sort of saving a couple of family Bibles, there's a family Bible kit that comes with the box and the gloves and the tissue paper. And it takes the guesswork for home archivists out of trying to figure out how much tissue you need and what size of box. And I make sure you measure materials, but really Gaylord Archival, Hollinger is another company that produces the archival quality materials.
So you've helped me figure out what of the enormous amount of stuff I have in my house I should keep. You've given me some great advice about what should I do with this stuff to make sure that it's preserved and to make sure that I know what it is and that my kids and my grandkids know what it is and why it's important. But where should I keep this stuff? What's a good place to store this great trove of my family's story?
So this is a hard question because I actually have two answers. And if you are keeping that material at home, you want to make sure that you keep it where it is protected from damage, from water damage, from pests, from rodents. The attic and the basement is not the ideal place to keep that material. You want it in a humidity-free zone as much as possible. You also want it somewhere where it's protected from day-to-day things that happen in the house. I mean, I would love to display the great, I have my great-grandfather's World War I uniform. And when I first got it, I thought, I want to display that. You know what? It's in an archival box flat, stored away, because I don't, the risk of having it out and the risk of it deteriorating is high. And so keep materials in a safe place. I will usually have a designated spot in a closet where on a shelf where the materials are, that's free from piping. I look to see if there's a leak somewhere, what's going to happen. That's if you decide to keep it at home. One of the, I think, the hardest decisions that you might have to make is what materials might not necessarily be the best things to keep in your house, right? If you have 50 years worth of yearbooks for a school that you had a relative who taught at or was affiliated with, you might look towards a local archive to actually be the caretaker of those materials. And that's a hard decision, because giving up part of what you consider to be your home archive to an institution is difficult. And you want to talk with your family members and talk with others. But ironically, sometimes the safest place for a home or a family archive is actually not in your home. It's at another facility that has proper training and materials and will help keep those records safe.
So those are some of the characteristics of this other repository that we might go to, the proper training and materials. Are there other things that we should look for if we do make that decision to donate our family's archive to another repository?
There's a couple of things that I look for. First and foremost, I look at the staff that's there. And how do they treat their materials? Not only in physical, handling the materials, but if they're interacting with patrons. Do I want this collection to be accessible for others to research? Do I want it just preserved? So I look at the staff. I also look at the institution itself. Is this an archive that has 50 or 100 years behind it, or has some sort of funding behind it that lets me know that in 100 years, it's still going to be there.
Got it.
And I also, I usually ask questions like, where physically do you keep the materials? Just to see, it might look wonderful from the outside, but you don't know where they're actually storing the material. Sometimes they have to be stored off-site because of space considerations, and that's okay. It's important to ask those types of questions when you're looking at different repositories.
Got it. Got it. I'll put in a little plug here in New York State. We maintain a directory of repositories that store non-government records. You can find it through our State Archives website to identify a potential location where your family's records might appropriately be kept. So, well, okay, so there's my shameless plug for the State Archives.
Well, I think it's another point actually is, you offer that service, which is terrific because most people don't know where to start in looking for resources, but not all archives, archives don't keep everything. The New York State Archives has a very specific mandate, and they're not going to take the Taylor personal collection of stuff. they're just not. And so you have to be realistic about finding an archive that actually has your materials sort of within its collection policy, within its mandate.
I think that's an important point, the collection policy and understanding what it is. And really, really excellent point. We've talked a lot about paper records, about newspapers, books, the physical stuff that we inherit that fills our attic, or, well, not fill our attic, that fills our living room or our den, and that we've moved up out of the basement because we want it to be preserved. But more and more, all of our stuff is in digital form. So we'll talk about photographs. I don't know too many people who do print photography anymore. It's all digital. So I don't have a film camera anymore. I have my phone, or I have a digital camera. What do I do with all of those digital photos that are, filling it up my phone or my iCloud or whatever? What do I do with all that?
It's another very timely question. I think because we're facing this and it just grows exponentially. And one of the first steps is almost like you would when you start with the paper archive and you start looking around your house and deciding what's archival and what's not archival. Spending some time to go through all of your photos. Realize that you might not need all 5 variations of the blurry photo before you got the one. Making the really tough decision to delete some photos, or at least move them into a non-archival bunch, so to speak, right? We don't just save these for posterity. And then taking time to develop a system and actually label the photos with a file name. You can decide how you do it within your own family. It could be that you label the photograph with the person's name or the place. I do a numbering system, and then I have another sort of database that tells me what every single number is for. But the importance of labeling those photographs and organizing them, even if you're storing them all on iCloud, don't just store them in a folder called photographs. That's the equivalent of leaving behind a box called photographs with no description of it at all. So take some time, filter through what's there, and organize some of the photos and actually make a decision which photos to save and which photos not to save. And by all means, change the file name from img_000 something, because you'll never know what it is. And you can do some other features by, you can right click and add some of the properties to a photo, so you can keep the name within the metadata of that file, so as it gets transferred from place to place. But really the key thing to start is just decide what you need and what you don't need, and then start to organize those in a method that makes sense for you and for your family.
I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball with a follow-up question to that. And okay, we've been making all these great photographs and all of that. Are they going to last on the iCloud or the Google Drive or wherever I've put them? Are they going to continue to be useful to me? Can I point my web browser of 20 years from now at them and use them?
This comes from someone that thinks about this every day. You can tell, and one of the great challenges that we face. I mean, try opening a Microsoft Word document that was created in Word 2003 or 1998 on a modern computer, and you'll probably run into some issues. And the same things can happen with photos. While online services like iCloud and Dropbox are terrific for now, we didn't have iCloud 30 years ago, and we don't know what we'll have 30 years from now. And so one thing that I try and do without having the resources of a huge institution for archiving electronic records is to convert and sort of remain vigilant about moving to the next technology where possible, rather than leaving everything, oh great, I did that project 5 years ago, I'm going to leave it on iCloud. So that constant transition to the next version, saving things in TIFF and JPEG file formats so that they're not compressed, because the more compressed a digital file is, the more likelihood it might be to have problems in the future. So be okay with having a solution that keeps files in a very large file format if needed. Again, that TIFF, that JPEG file, and then move and convert with technology. Don't be one of these people that still has a software program for photos that's no longer being supported, because that's one of the most dangerous things is, if iCloud goes away and that's where your photos were, then you're not gonna be able to point your web browser to them. So it's that constant migration process from one to the next.
Good advice. Good advice. Well, let's talk a little bit about the changing way people, families communicate. We're creating today the archive that future generations are going to look at to understand who we are and what we were all about. So, like, my family has a weekly Zoom call, which is a great forum for everybody to talk and hear what's going on and all of that. What do we do with those types of things? The emails, we don't write too many letters so much anymore. What are some strategies we can take for the kinds of things that we're making now that are born digital?
It's something we don't think about enough. I mean, record those Zoom calls that you're having with your family, and just like you would a digital photograph, figure out a way to preserve and share and save them. And the voicemails, I constantly on my phone will save a voicemail I have from a relative, because I wish I had started earlier, because there's great tidbits, there's great things that you get in some of those messages, but really, record, make sure that everyone understands they're being recorded for prosperity purposes. So you're not violating any privacy there. Record and then preserve those. Create an archive of video recordings of your family Zoom calls, or of emails that you even have. Again, decide what to keep and what not to keep, and make sure that you're conscious about, well, how will I access this in 5 years or 10 years? How will I know that it's there versus just a random folder called Zoom recordings from 2020 or 2021? But it's that conscious process even before the event occurs to say, we're going to record this, here's how we're going to save it, and here's how it's going to be accessible for others to use in the future.
So it's really about, you need a plan, you need to know what you're going to keep, and you need to spend the time doing I'll call it curation of that stuff.
Right. And it might be that the duty falls to you. You're the family historian, you're the family archivist, and you might be the only one on the call thinking about those types of things. But someone has to, because if you don't, it's possible you're not going to be able to preserve that. Good
point. Well, that's a good point that you raised there about you're the family historian, you're the one that's going to keep things. You and I love this stuff. We're into it. But right now, what are the ways that we can try to engage our families? Like, what are some of the things that we can do today to create that sort of living archive? And so to help us do some of the identification of photographs or whatever. What are some strategies?
I admit one, there isn't one thing that's going to work for everyone. It's going to be different for every family. But I do think that family historians, by our nature, we have a tendency to perhaps overload when we're trying to get others interested because we have so much to share. And really, I would suggest taking a sort of very, very systematic scaled down approach with one or two things. Sometimes it is an object. I mean, objects are fantastic entry points because you have to think about the gateway into someone understanding the value of other things. Right? Opening up the 600-page family genealogy is sometimes not, it's not the thing that's going to get someone really, really excited about something. You know, opening up a photo album from someone's military service on Veterans Day or Memorial Day might be a gateway that then leads to more questions.
Mm-hmm.
I usually approach the strategy in terms of asking questions and then helping my family members and relatives to get into the habit of asking me questions and then providing solutions, providing answers, and especially the questions that I say, well, I don't know. I'm still working on that. Let's go find out. Because really a good family historian knows how to ask the questions. So, you know, work with your family members to help them gradually start to ask those questions little by little by little.
So is that we all have folks in our families who know a lot, who have lots of shared experiences with us. And is it worthwhile to talk like at a family gathering? You know, we haven't done a lot of that, although we have virtually, I guess maybe in some cases more family gatherings, to sort of throw out some big questions and say, tell me about this particular incident, and gather those stories from people.
You know, absolutely, and ask the same question from, you know, to multiple relatives, because everyone has a version of of the event. It might not be the same story. It's one of, I think, the most exciting parts of connecting with relatives is, you know, get your 5 aunts and uncles together on Zoom or online and say, I want to talk about this family vacation that each of you have mentioned, and let them talk. And, you know, start to see what one remembers and what one misremembers. And, you know, it goes back and forth, and make sure that in that moment, you're actually capturing your family history. It's the beautiful thing about technology, because you're getting information about an event or about people, but you're also getting that living history from relatives. And I think in many ways, it's some of the most valuable and personal family history you can get is a relative talking with another relative about about something in the family story.
Mm-hmm. So family historians and family archivists not only need to do selection, decide what to keep, they need to do preservation and figure out how to keep it. Now it sounds like they also need to be oral historians too,
Right.
and come up with those interviews.
Right. I mean, you know, and sometimes the simplest questions. One thing that someone shared with me a while ago is you always end an oral history with, you know, what haven't I asked about that you want to tell me, right? You leave that door open, and sometimes you get the best information because that person's already warmed up. They've had a conversation with you, and they say, oh, but you know, you didn't ask me about this particular part. But yeah, we need to start asking questions of the living generation.
Okay, the living generation. Well, maybe can we talk for a little bit about the generation, the younger generation? You know, the teenagers or the early young adults. And you know, there's a lot of conversation about how folks don't necessarily appreciate the past as much as perhaps they used to. How do we have the kind of conversation that you and I are having now with a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old about the family's history? How do we engage them?
I wish I knew the singular answer to that, to just tell everybody, you know what, just a couple of ideas is to, you know, begin to engage with them on their own terms. If they're in school and learning about something that relates to the family history, if they're learning about an occupation, or they're learning about immigration, or learning about another topic, that is an opportunity to introduce something from your family story with them, but it's engaging them sort of on their level. I mean, I think so often we come in with a pedigree chart approach, right? I'm going to tell you about your third great grandfather. And the truth is they're sitting enjoying, they're playing a game, they're doing something else. So engage them on their level. I know some people who have used video games, for example, as a way in. Oh, you're playing a game about something. Did you know you had an ancestor involved in, and try and personalize it. But really, it's looking for opportunities that will make it important to them. Sometimes even just the reference. We've just finished a holiday season where family recipes came out. And even just reminding them, we're making this because this is what your grandparents did, your great grandparents did, or the reason why we do this every day is because of this. And that gentle reminder is sometimes better than the dialogue sort of biographical approach of everything that we did. But it's about finding something that's accessible to them, that someone in the younger generation can actually take and internalize, that will matter, versus just something that happened in the distant past that I'm not necessarily associated with.
Great point. Great point. And I'm looking at the Q&A, and there's things are starting to pile up. And so we probably want to allocate a fair amount of time to answering some of the questions that I think Josie's gonna handle for us. But before you and I stop talking, is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
I do want to give a huge shout out and recognition to the work that you and your team does in preserving our state's records. Archives work hand in hand. Personal archives are one thing, government archives are quite another. And it's really understanding how genealogists use both of these resources. But I just want to make sure everyone listening knows that these are issues that your team deals with on a grander scale across multiple departments, and thinking really, really into the future, because we're gonna be able to access New York State's history because of the work that you do today. And I think that's an important, it's important for people to realize there are a lot of people that think about these questions, and we couldn't do our work without the work that you do.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. I really appreciate that. And I think your point is really, really a good one. That, well, we at the State Archives preserve the records of government and the big things that are happening. Individual stories of individual situations happen in your family archives. And it's part of a continuum of telling the story of our state and our communities and all the people and institutions that make it up. And I know we at the State Archives are especially grateful to NYG&B for what you do in helping connect people to both the big story and the little ones. So thank you. So I see Josie's joined us, and we probably have, looks like about 50 questions.
There are quite a few questions. So I'm going to jump right into them so that we don't waste any time. But the first one, actually, Tom, that I'd like to get out of the way is sort of for you, and it piggybacks on what you were just saying. One person was wondering about the collections policy of the New York State Archives and where they could find more information about that. And I thought you might have an idea.
I might have a little bit of an idea. The New York State Archives is required in law to collect and preserve and make available the official government records of New York's colonial and state governments. So our collection policy is really defined by the legislation that created the State Archives, which, by the way, is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. The State Archives was established in 1971. So we don't collect the records of personal individuals. We don't collect the records of private corporations. We only collect the records of government. As a sort of a last resort, we do have some records of local governments, largely on microfilm, but a vast majority of our collection is state government and colonial government records. So our website, if you go to www.archives.nysed.gov, and there's a little link called About Our Records. It'll give you a pretty good encapsulation of the kinds of records that we have from the colonial period, but also from the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of New York State government.
Great. So Josh, we've had a lot of questions about digitizing and sort of the nitty gritty of that. For example, what file formats are the best? You know, would you be looking for a TIFF or is a JPEG okay? What DPI should you be going for? Are there particular, you know, types or pieces of equipment that you would recommend for that? Lots of questions about that.
All right. Well, there's lots of answers potentially. You know, I will say for some of the work that I do in my own family, I save as TIFF files usually is my default file format. And I will do it at minimum 600 DPI. Usually I go higher than that, depending on how much I want to sort of save and what it is I'm actually digitizing. There are a variety of cameras now. There's sort of one of the brands is Hovercam, and again, it's one of many brands, but it's basically a tabletop camera that has a light and sort of sits above you. So you're not actually turning materials over and putting them on a scanner. You're actually capturing an image of a table. And they're you know, usually they range anywhere from $100 to about $300, but they do, you know, something that you can use to capture photographs and documents and other materials that you have at home. So I mean, I use something like that when I'm capturing materials. I also know people that use a mount for their phone and they capture, you know, right on their phone. And lighting is key. You want to make sure you have good lighting. I sort of have a spot on my desk where between the hours of, you know, certain AM and certain PM, the lighting's good at night, and that's where I sort of capture materials. But I like sort of that overhead camera approach at home. It gives a high quality image and allows me to capture a lot of materials at once rather than sort of resetting and having to damage materials potentially with a flatbed type scanner. So hopefully some answers there.
Yes, that was definitely some answers. And we also had a bunch of questions about letters and whether or not those should stay folded in envelopes. Should they be unfolded and kept with the envelope but laid flat? How do we handle letters?
Oh, this was I should have mentioned this. Letters, unfold and keep flat as much as you can, as long as you're not damaging the actual material. Right, you might have something that would absolutely shred it to unfold it. Unfold where possible, keep it separate from the letter. Make sure that you look at what type of material is actually on that envelope. You know, you don't want to be storing something flat next to something that has glue on it or something. So keep those separate. And also very important, remove metal, remove your paper clips, remove your staples, and that just damages materials over time. So flatten out wherever possible.
Great. And what about photocopying to make a preservation copy? How damaging is that? And how do you feel about laminating?
I would never laminate. Lamination terrifies me. And I know I have some laminated family documents that were given to me, and it's there and it destroys the document. That never laminate in that case, I would say. As far as preservation copies, it really depends upon the material and how fragile the material is. I have a family Bible, for example, that has never been photocopied because the binding on it is so poor that to physically turn it over and make a copy of it, it would fall apart. But the overhead scanner allows me to make a preservation copy of it without ever having to actually touch. I don't have to touch the material other than to open up the book, sort of get it steady, take the photograph, and then put the tissue paper back in and preserve it. So it's up to you to make a judgment call on how fragile the material is. Sometimes you risk it for a preservation copy because you don't know in 5 or 6 years what it's going to look like if you're still going to be able to read the materials. I have family letters written in pencil that we photocopied 20 years ago, and thank goodness we did, because even with proper preservation, the pencil and the paper has faded so much that you can no longer read them. So do your preservation copies sooner rather than later with your materials.
Great. We also had several questions about how exactly to keep your information with your photographs. So, for example, do we write the information on the back of the photograph? If we keep a separate document, maybe on our computer, a spreadsheet or something, how do we make sure that that information doesn't get separated from the photographs? And as sort of a related question, what about photographs that we know have writing on the back of them, but have already been attached to a surface? Is there a way to safely remove those and gather that information without harming the photograph?
Boy, I might also need some advice from Tom on what they do with with some of these. I will say from my sort of, in as far as keeping things together, I have a file on my computer that anyone who's related to me knows that is the file, and it's got the listing of all the documents I have. It's got links to different photographs, and I also have given that file as a very generous Christmas gift to lots of relatives. They get an update of it. And the idea being that if something happens to my copy, there is another copy of it out there, and at least know that is the file. And I also keep in sort of the one of the boxes, I have a sort of portable hard drive with that material as well as a secondary backup, just in case something happens.
I think you said something that there's a term that we use in our business a little bit. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. So taking that index to your photos and sending it out, having lots of different copies of it will ensure that stuff's protected, that you can get to it. Somebody's got to have a copy of it.
Right. And then the question about sort of handwriting that we know is on the back of a photo, but is pasted down. And they sell tools, like Gaylord Archival sells tools to help you safely remove materials. And that is a judgment call that you have to make. And depending upon the age of the material, a professional conservationist might be able to give you, ideas of how to do it, or actually be able to do it themselves. I have seen some things where I know there's something on the back, but it would destroy the photograph to remove it. And so I have to live with the decision that I want the photograph more than what I think is written on the back.
And that almost gets back to your opportunity to have interviews with family members. We can't get to what's written on the back. Do you remember this family gathering or this family event or this individual?
Right. The one thing about scrapbooks that I always find interesting is, we worry about things that are pasted down at what might be sort of lost underneath the glue there. But if it's a scrapbook, there's a chance that someone else has been taken through that scrapbook at another point. And so sit down with the relative and go through the scrapbook and see what they remember being told about that photograph.
So we've had a couple of questions about preserving more unusual forms of media, for example, tin types. But my favorite was this question about the shrunken V-mail from World War II, which I confess I had to Google. So this was actually apparently a microfilm of letters home would be microfilmed, and then the microfilm would be transported and the letter sort of recreated from that, because it allowed them to transport more letters, is my quick Google understanding. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But somebody has a collection of these and is wondering how to preserve those.
Tom, you mind if you deal with microfilm than I do in materials.
Well, and I don't think the letters are on microfilm that these folks, because they would print them out and deliver them to people. They were just a smaller version. And my recollection is most of those are on pretty acidic paper, which is always a challenge. And they're smaller. And that may be an opportunity both for digitization, so that you can get it into a digital format and also make it bigger to make it easier to read. But also transferring it, and this gets back to the photocopying it on acid-free paper, and in a photocopying process. So, because again, during the war, the materials they had, the good paper was being used for something else. So that's, so I would say transfer it if you can.
Great. So there's also been some questions about how to organize your records and your documents. Do you organize them, by date, by family group, by generation? How, what's the organizing principle that you might want to start with?
Well, as an archivist is typically taught to try and leave things in original order where possible, right? You don't want to disrupt the order in which the material was created. With family history materials, I think sometimes the reality is there isn't an order when it was created. It was stored in boxes as family history and sort of shifted off. I organize archival materials typically by family group. And then I sort of will sort those alphabetically. So, this is the Taylor family, this is the Brown family, and create sort of systems within there. So usually by name, by group, by material or subject type, and then by date. But that's if it didn't come already organized. So, it depends. I might have a collection of letters that came to me from various individuals, but they were letters to a certain individual about a specific subject. And so I would keep those together because that's how the material arrived. But for family history materials, I typically will try and find sort of a surname or family designation, and then a subject, and then date if needs be, to sort of file materials along. And also make sure, your family history collection isn't necessarily complete when you get it. You might collect photographs for 20 years from different people. And so you want to create an organization system that can include those materials rather than having to start over again when you get something else. Because the last thing you want are photos of your great-grandfather here, here, and here, because you had 3 different systems running at various times in your research.
Do you have any suggestions about how one might save voicemails that you mentioned, or other types of voice recording? Are there formats or ways to save those that are best practice?
So I actually go in on my, you plug your phone on the computer, you can go in through actually your file explorer and see your individual audio files. And I save them as audio files. I just copy them out of the phone folder and put them onto my sort of family audio recording folder, and then add a list of what I have and the time, the length of that particular voicemail.
And is there some sort of tool or platform that you would recommend for people to use, as a larger family group, to be able to share, their records and information in a centralized place? Is there an app or a website that you recommend?
There's a couple of options. There are commercial family tree providers, sites like Ancestry, MyHeritage, that will keep family trees with documents. And there are also commercial family history software programs like Legacy and Roots Magic and Family Tree Maker that allows you to actually have a version of your family tree. You can gather information from others and you can attach certain documents with it. And I will be honest in saying that I don't think we are at a point yet where we have the proper collaborative sort of family tree tool that preserves everything properly and allows me to add photographs from here, and that they're always going to be mine with my family forever and ever. And so mine are still very much in a cloud-based service with my own indexes as I share them back and forth. Because I think the danger, and this is where when we talk about archives and sort of moving into the future with digital archives, when you're using a service from a commercial company, no matter how beloved that company is, when that company transforms to something else or ceases to exist, your data and the way it's organized might also cease to exist. And so you could have the world's best online tree wherever, and if that company decides that they're not going to support that anymore, you've now lost the ability to access that information. So it's something I always keep in mind when I'm looking at services. What's the background of the organization? How long are they actually going to be around? And what happens afterwards? Can I get my data back out after I've spent so much time and investment putting it in?
And I think, Josh, that hits on an important dimension. There's preservation, which you might take all of your raw material and put it somewhere. And then there's access using one of those services that'll facilitate people finding what they're looking for. The two together are critical. One helps access, the other ensures that when that company goes away or that software changes or you decide you're not going to pay the bill, you still have all the raw material that makes up your family archive.
Right.
Are there any copyright issues that people should be aware of with older photos, if they're sharing them, or is there anything they should be worried about?
Yes. I actually there's a genealogist called Judy Russell who writes on copyright. She uses a blog called The Legal Genealogist, and she writes on copyright all the time and addresses some of those issues. And it all depends upon ownership of the photograph, the age of the photograph. And I have a rule personally to protect privacy and copyright where I don't share something with someone unless I have permission to do so, or unless it's something that I would share about myself. Right? I'm creating a preservation copy of my family's archives. That doesn't mean that I'm going to just hand it over to anybody right away, because I don't. There are certain things that have been given to me because they want them to be preserved, but that the copyright is somebody else. That they own that right, and I would never want to violate that copyright.
Okay, I think that I tried to, there were many, many questions, and I've tried to condense them into categories. So I hope I didn't miss anyone's, oh, here's one that we did not touch on that I feel like maybe we should. If you are thinking about donating any of your family records to an archives, for whatever reason, do you want to have some sort of an agreement with that archive? How does that work?
So I will give the answer from my view, and I'm interested to see what Tom would say from his view, from his institutional view. Absolutely, a donor agreement. Supporting everything from who can access the collection, how big is the collection, how is it going to be processed, when is it going to be processed, and also keeping in mind the funds that are needed to actually process that collection. There are many archives that are happy to accept collections with the recognition that it might be a while before someone actually processes and is able to look through and make those accessible. And so, one thing I look for in the donor agreement is I want to know how I can ensure those materials are going to actually be processed and used. So you do want an agreement. You want an understanding of, there might be materials in this collection that I don't hold the copyright to. And so I can't give you the copyright to this collection because I don't have it. I might have physical possession of it. So you want to state that very clearly within a donor agreement between the institution and yourself.
You hit it. It's the donor agreement is the key to everything. It's the key to what kind of rights do you as the donor retain. And most repositories want to limit that because they want to take over the ownership of that, because they have to administer that collection forever, because you're donating it. When can the collection be opened to the public to do their research in? Some collections, and we read about it in the newspaper, are closed for 70 years. And then all of a sudden it's available. I just read about one recently. But also, making sure that that repository understands any specific risk constraints or things that you want to apply, but whether they're privacy, whether they're copyright, et cetera.
Great. Well, thank you very much to both of our speakers today. Josh and Tom, thank you so much for your time. There are many, many more questions, but we're out of time. So thank you for your time and for sharing all of these insights. And thank you to everyone who attended today. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and you would like to have some more of it, you can send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And as a special offer, we would love to send you a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. So don't forget to do that. And please tune in for our next online speaker series, which is going to be at 12:30 on Tuesday, February 16th. We're going to be joined by State Archivist Tom Ruller, along with the Director of the New Netherland Institute, Steve Mackerlane, Director of the New Netherland Research Center, Dr. Charlie Gehring, and former Associate Director of the New Netherland Research Center, Dr. Yanni Venema. And we're going to be discussing insights from the latest volumes of translations of Dutch colonial documents that are at the New York State Archives. So we hope you can join us for that. And you can visit our website at nysarchivestrust.org to subscribe to New York Archives Magazine if you haven't done that already, and also to learn more about our upcoming speaker series events. Thanks again so much, Josh and Tom, for joining us today. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.